Well, let's get started. So welcome everyone to this Refugee Law Initiative conference panel session on Chain-Externalisation of EU migration management policies. Thank you so much for joining us on a Friday afternoon. My name is Dr. Emily McDonnell and I'm with Human Rights Watch in the UK. I'm also an RLI associate here and a member of the Externalization Working Group. We have four wonderful panelists with us today, also from the Externalization Working Group, to discuss the dynamic of what has been conceptualized as chain externalization, or the mirroring of EU migration policies to third countries that the EU partners with and outsources to. So this panel is designed to stimulate consideration of this new and developing conceptual framework on chain externalization and the effect on externalization on partner countries. And each of our four panelists today will present from a different perspective. So including the conventional view of externalization and a critique of it in the context of EU-Tunisia relations. Then moving to the core concept and idea of chain externalization in the context of Turkey and West Africa, before adding another link to the chain and a new dynamic or modality, which is outsourcing to non-state actors in the context of Libya. And I'd say please have a look in the program for further details on their papers. This panel is especially fitting because during the plenary session on Wednesday, which I'm sure many of us here attended, the RLI Declaration on Externalization and Asylum was adopted alongside an analytical paper. And this reflects the collaborative work of a range of experts and scholars here at the RLI over the past 9 months, which sets out the key international law considerations on externalization. And this was published in the International Journal of Refugee Law, and someone will post that in the chat shortly. Each of our speakers today will have 10 minutes for their presentation. And please, during their presentations, pose your questions and comments to the speakers in the chat box on Zoom. After the speakers have finished, we'll open up for broader discussion, reflection, and comments, and our speakers will each have a chance to respond to your comments and questions. And I know from speaking to the panelists that they're very keen to build on this concept and the case studies that they're using and invite participants to think of examples in their contexts. Please remember to keep your microphones on mute and your videos off unless you're a presenter. And the session is being recorded and will be posted on the RLI website. If you don't wish to appear in the podcast, then please leave the session now. And if you wish to hide the live transcript at the bottom of your screen, please click on the Hide Subtitles button. So without further ado, I will first turn to Dr. Maria Giulia Joffre of Edge Hill University in the UK, who will be presenting on EU-Tunisia cooperation on border management and rescue at sea, assessing Tunisia as a place of safety and a safe country. Thank you, Maria Giulia, over to you.
Thank you very much, Emily. Before starting, let's start to share a PowerPoint presentation, very brief one, but let me do that and let me know if it's working.
It is.
Yeah. Okay, that's fine. So I think we can start now. So again, thanks thanks a lot, Emily, for this presentation. What I'd like to discuss today, following your introduction, is how the externalization approach to border management adopted by the European Union, whose main purpose is reducing arrivals of unwanted migrants by delocalizing responsibility, has since the very beginning raised several human rights concerns, in particular with regard to the right to live, the right to life, the prohibition of inhuman and degrading treatment, and of collective expulsions. And even if the main target countries has always been Libya, a number of short and medium-term actions concern Tunisia, as well as countries such as Egypt, Algeria, Morocco. However, my primary focus today will be on Tunisia, as this country is becoming the new interlocutor of the European Union and the European states, with which we intend to cooperate in the interception of migrants and in search and rescue operations at sea. Indeed, search and rescue policies are becoming a major instrument through which European states delegate to third countries the management of their borders to prevent arrivals of migrants in Europe, even if this means that the Mediterranean is now the deadliest area in the world, with more than 24,000 persons that have already lost their lives since 2014. And departures from Tunisian shores involves not only Tunisian nationals, let's think that they are the first nationality of arrivals in Italy, but also migrants from Sub-Saharan Africa and Asia. Therefore, the two primary questions that I'm addressing here are, first, which are the main tools used by the European Union to delegate border management responsibility to Tunisia, and second, whether Tunisia can be considered a safe country, both for nationals and third country nationals, as well as a place of safety for disembarkation. And among the most relevant initiatives concerning EU-Africa cooperation there was the establishment in 2015 of the EU Trust Fund for Africa, which aims to address the root causes of instability, forced displacement, irregular migration, and to contribute to a better migration management. And however, what the better migration management then means in practice for the different actors involved is still an open issue and a matter for debate. With the objective of obtaining cooperation in the external management of migration through financial support, the EU Trust Fund involves programs in 26 partner countries in Africa. It aims to contribute to the stabilization and development of these areas by supporting capacity building of third countries, also in the field of migration and border management. However, most of the funding under the EU Trust Fund reached those countries of origin and transit of migrants, and not the poorest or those that could benefit more from development aid. So with regard to migration by sea and the process of externalization at the maritime frontier, we are assisting to what I define as a paradigm shift from pushbacks to pushbacks by proxy, also called pullbacks, but also to episodes of non-rescue, delays in the succors, with a consequent risk for the lives of people on the boats. It's presented as a key tool to save lives and avoid dangerous journeys. Cooperation at sea is instead a way, as we all know very well, for European states to prevent onward movement of people to Europe, skip jurisdiction and therefore potential responsibility by avoiding any extraterritorial physical contact with people in distress. And in many instances, what is happening in practice is that the maritime rescue coordination centers of southern countries, in particular Italy, Malta, are informed of a distress event and decide either not to intervene or to intervene very late or to wait for the arrival of their partner in Libya or Tunisia, who conclude the rescue or interception operation, bringing the persons back to North African ports where they are detained or ill-treated or pushed back to countries of origin, such as in the pending case before the European Court of Human Rights, SS versus Italy, but also another landmark decision is the AS and others versus Italy case on search and rescue decided by the UN Human Rights Committee in January last year. And while Libya is by no means the most emblematic case of cooperation on migration control, especially at sea, the European Union is also supporting Tunisia with more than 34 million euros for the development of an integrated border management program funded under the EU Trust Fund, whose main goal is that of combating irregular migration. Italy is the main implementing partner. And the lack of transparency on bilateral cooperation agreements has been denounced by several organizations. It seems that Italy has committed itself to transfer 11 million euros with the aim of reinforcing border management infrastructures, training Tunisian security forces on preventing departures and intercepting boats in Tunisian national waters. In particular, the Italian Minister of Foreign Affairs has threatened the suspension of 6 million euros dedicated to cooperation and development in lack of an insufficient engagement of Tunisian authorities in preventing departures of boats from its coast. And since August 2020, there was an increase in repatriation numbers of Tunisian citizens. Italy has completed also a system for taking and comparing the fingerprints, has supplied vehicles and repaired 6 patrol vessels for Tunisian authorities. But since 2017, we have started to observe also more structured efforts by the European Union to support the Tunisian authorities with the aim of preventing boat departures. For instance, the EU has encouraged Tunisia participation in the Sea-Horse Mediterranean network to exchange information between maritime authorities. Italy is also installing the ISMARIS surveillance system for the Tunisian Coast Guard to support the Tunisian government in its efforts to monitor its land and sea borders. And since 2019, sea interceptions at sea, sea interception conducted by the Tunisian Coast Guard or Navy have started to grow from about 4,000 in 2019 up to more than 25,000 in 2021. And this operation did not only concern boats departed from Tunisia, but also from Libya. So all in all, what we observe is that migration partnerships before and after the new EU Pact on Migration and Asylum are negotiated with countries that are summarily considered safe on the sole justification of their relevance for migration management purposes and without due consideration of their domestic human rights situation and the treatment of migrants and refugees. So moving to the last part, with regard to the reliability of Tunisia for the externalization, the European externalization process, while visions of homosexuality, women's rights and capital punishment are still quite conservative, terrorist attacks in 2015 by Islamist militants have also contributed to showing some concerns on the safety of this country, especially with regard to political repression and possible abuses by police authorities, lack of an asylum system and legislation, arbitrary detention of migrants, risk of refoulement and of chain deportations, and then risk for the protection of specific vulnerable categories. According to media sources, NGO reports and the interviews that I've conducted with 2 colleagues from Tunisia and Italy in the framework of the Extern project, there in cases of refoulement at the Tunisian land borders with Libya and Algeria are also very frequent, and they have concerned also people with specific needs, women and children that have been pushed back without any access to identification or asylum procedures or any other form of assistance. For what concerns deportations to Libya, they've been reported as being conducted after previous operations of interceptions at sea by the Tunisian Coast Guards and Navy of people who were trying to reach Europe by boat. So to conclude, I think that despite the democratic transition, Tunisia cannot be considered yet a safe country for migrants and refugees in transit to Europe. Its safety can be questioned also with respect to Tunisian nationals who are intercepted in their attempt to leave the country. as a consequence of the domestic human rights situation and the risk of chain refoulement, and despite the pressure of the European Union, Tunisia cannot be considered either a place of safety for disembarkation in the framework of its cooperation with European countries. Indeed, as stated by the IMO guidelines on the treatment of people rescued at sea, disembarkation must also be avoided in territories where there is a risk for the lives and freedoms of asylum seekers and refugees recovered at sea. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maria Julia. Second speaker today is Dr. Gamze Overschick from the University of Gothenburg in Sweden, who will be presenting their paper on chain externalization of migration policies in the context of EU-Turkey relations.
Hello all. Thank you very much, Emily. And it's great to be a part of the RLI conference this year, and I hope we will have the chance to get together in person maybe next time. Also thanks a lot for the participants, for the listeners. It's a challenging time of the day and end of the conference, so thank you very much for your patience. Today I will be speaking about the chain externalization dynamic as we observe in the context of EU-Turkey relations. And as Emily pointed out, this concept of chain externalization is a concept that we are trying to newly develop, contribute to the literature. And if in this panel, we are trying to look at different variations of it in different geographical contexts. Building on Maria Julia's contribution on a classical approach to externalization and its adversities as observed in the context of Tunisia, I would like to continue with the conceptualization of chain externalization, and then I will talk about how this manifests itself in the EU-Turkey context. I will talk about 3 specific examples of how we can observe this in the EU-Turkey context. First of all, as for the concept, as I mentioned, this is a new concept that we are trying to develop, and we are very excited about this because although we have been able to so far determine certain examples, I'm sure it is possible to observe the same phenomenon in different geographical contexts, and we would be very much interested to hear your opinions on this. So we are interested a lot about the concept itself, but we are trying to show this through different geographical contexts. And as also the Declaration on Externalization reflects, even the concept of externalization itself is very much debated. The contours of it is very much debated. So this adds another aspect to this debate, I think. And in line with that, we can develop the concept. What we mean by chain externalization is basically how the EU externalization policies are transferred to the third countries, because EU implements these externalization policies to externalize migration control to third countries. And we are looking at the dynamic at how this in turn causes these third countries to also implement their externalization policies of their own in return. So this creates a chain dynamic in that sense, because the externalization policies triggered from EU to the third countries are then copied from third countries to further other transit and countries of origin, other transit countries and countries of origin. Sometimes this happens as a reflex by the third country, because because of the burden of the externalization policies, they want to further externalize it as a reflex, but it is sometimes also demand coming from the EU side, so that their externalization, the EU externalization policies are full proof in one sense. The adversities of externalization, as Maria Giulia showcased in the case of Tunisia, they spread through this chain externalization dynamic, and this is the problematic side of it, that as we see it. This can be seen in safe country practices, outsourcing of refugee processing, carrier sanctions, and other types of externalization policies. So we see they are being mirrored from EU policies to other third country policies. But it can also take the form of outsourcing to private actors, and this will be showed by the final presentation today on Libya. So based on this conceptualization, I would like to now move on to the manifestations of chain externalization in case of EU-Turkey relations, and I will show you how the EU externalization policies as reflected to Turkey are then adopted by Turkey towards third countries and creating this chain dynamic. The first example that I would like to talk about is it concerns the norm diffusion dynamic about the EU externalization tools, because in Turkey the formation of the legislation in migration and asylum field was very much fueled by the accession process to EU. So EU had a great influence in the legislative and administrative reform process that took place around 2013. The result, as a trigger of the chain externalization, this norm diffusion occurred by adoption of similar legislation within Turkey, as taking example the EU acquis. So when we look at the relevant provisions, we see that in Turkish legislation, it is very much, in fact, almost copied from EU acquis. As a result, as an outcome of this situation, we see that the externalization tools adopted in EU acquis are also reflected, are also transferred to Turkish context, and especially concerning carrier sanctions, the concept of safe third country and concept of country of first asylum, we can see that the provisions are almost identical in Turkish legislation and EU acquis. So we here see the direct transfer of these externalization tools to be implemented by Turkey vis-a-vis other third countries. This is, as I said, triggered by the EU involvement in Turkish legislative and administrative reform, and as a result, these tools are now visible in Turkish context as well. The second example that I would like to talk about is it concerns readmission agreements. Readmission agreements are also appear as a form of externalization tools, and we can see that EU-Turkey dynamic affected Turkish position a lot with respect to other countries. The trigger was, of course, very obviously the EU-Turkey readmission agreement, which was concluded in 2013. This created an expectation that the stock of irregular migrants in Turkey would increase because of returns that will be conducted from EU to Turkey, and also because of the impact of the EU-Turkey readmission agreement, the deterrence impact of it, creating a decrease in the passages from Turkey to EU. So as a result, Turkey felt the necessity to find new ways to channel this stock further to other countries, or maybe to prevent with this deterrence effect, with a similar deterrence effect, to prevent incoming waves of migration from other countries to Turkey. So the outcome was execution of new readmission agreements by Turkey. So with the EU-Turkey readmission agreement, it was triggered that Turkey would execute new readmission agreements with countries of origin and countries of transit. This was an effort to shift the burden away to source countries. And when we look at the readmission agreements executed by Turkey, we see that out of 15 readmission agreements, 5 of them, 1/3 of them were executed after the EU-Turkey readmission agreement. And there are also ongoing negotiations with Afghanistan and Sudan in this regard. So we can see that Turkish government really invested in the execution of readmission agreements, and I think we think that this is a reflection of this is also triggered by the EU-Turkey readmission agreement. So this externalization tool between EU and Turkey became a blueprint for Turkey's externalization further to other countries. The final example that I would like to explain to you is concerns visa policy. Visa policy can also be a tool of externalization in the sense of how it is implemented. Here in EU-Turkey dynamic, the triggers were the Turkey's EU accession process and the visa liberalization dialogue between EU and Turkey that was commenced with the readmission, with the execution of the EU-Turkey readmission agreement. As a result of these, Turkey becoming part of these processes, this was actually a demand from EU side that Turkey adopts and aligns its visa policy with that of EU visa policies. This is outlined, this is underlined very clearly in the EU, in the accession reports about Turkey prepared by EU, and I just included the quotes here. For instance, from the final report on 2021, it was clearly said that Turkey should harmonize its visa policy with EU visa policy. This is also reflected in the visa liberalization roadmap reports, progress reports, and the same need is outlined there as well. And it does actually make sense from EU side, because when you look at the numbers of the, just as a brief comparison, just to give you an idea, I included the numbers of the countries that citizens of which do not need to obtain a visa, and citizens of which need to obtain a visa to come to Turkey and to come to EU. And when you look at the numbers, you can see that Turkey follows a much liberal visa policy compared to EU visa policy. And since this was a demand from the EU side, we can say that here there is also a similar chain dynamic where one policy, one externalization tool is exported to the third country with a view to further externalize migration control. So based on these 3 examples, I tried to show you how chain externalization works on EU-Turkey context, but also, as I said, beyond these geographical contexts, we are very much interested in developing this concept and seeing similar examples from other contexts. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Gamze. Lots of food for thought, and that leads me into asking and reminding our participants with us today to please post your comments and questions in the Zoom chat, because we'll be moving to the discussion after the next two presentations. So our third speaker today is Dr. Mariana Giliatti from Leiden University in the Netherlands. And she'll be presenting her paper on West Africa, the missing link of chain externalization. Thanks, Mariana.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Emily. And well, thanks everyone. I see that most of you are still here. Congratulations after 3 long days. Before I start with the presentation and share my screen as well, I would like to make one important correction. So I'm not based at Leiden University anymore, but I've started as an assistant professor of international European law at Radboud University, as you can see now, hopefully on the slide. And that's more important for my employer than it is for me, but I had to share that. So I will now expand and elaborate on the concept of chain externalization, looking specifically at the manifestation of this emerging trend in the Sahel region of West Africa, most importantly in Niger. And it should be noted that much of the focus on externalization has been placed on the EU's neighboring countries, namely the Balkan countries, Turkey, North Africa, while the emphasis on the external relations of the EU with West Africa is quite limited. So why do I choose to study this region? The Sahel region includes some of the poorest countries in the world and top recipients of EU development aid. It is also a priority area for the EU in relation to migration management because it's a traditionally transit area. The multiple and continuous conflicts and also the deteriorating security situation also generate displacement from these countries. So the Sahel is one of the main target areas of outsourcing EU migration management aims, policies, and tasks. And the EU cooperates with the countries of the region broadly. This cooperation takes the form of training and capacity building, of information exchange for the purpose of risk analysis, cooperation in the field of returns and readmission, intensely, for instance, with Nigeria. A Frontex liaison officer is placed in Niger. We also have in Mali the EU Cap Sahel, which is a European Union crisis management mission. The overall aims of this cooperation are mobility deterrence, border control, containment. It is quite telling that Maria Giulia mentioned it in the beginning. One of the carrots of the EU uses to secure the cooperation of its African counterparts for its own mobility deterrence aims is development aid. So assistance earmarked for sustainable development is in fact used to enhance the border management infrastructure. And now if we look closer, we see that externalization does not stop there. And I talk here about the externalization not only of concrete migration management measures, but also of the law and practices and the political priorities of the EU. In particular, the outsourcing of the EU migration policy to countries in the Sahel has influenced the law, policies, and practices in the region in a similar way, but also a bit different to Turkey, as I will explain. We see their regional policy moving towards stricter migration control, including the criminalization of migrants and those facilitating their irregular entry, but also further outsourcing and offshoring. So in fact, we see the implementation of EU required policies through chain externalization. And I will now provide some examples of how this manifests in practice to make the argument more concrete. And you see the first one already in the screen. It is the evacuation programs from Libya to Niger. So given the security situation in Libya, refugees and asylum seekers had to be evacuated by UNHCR. And that was done under the EU-funded emergency transit mechanism, the ETM. An agreement was made then with Niger to host the evacuees in Niamey. Niger agreed to this under the condition that all these refugees would be eventually resettled in Europe. As of 2019, a total of almost 3,000 people have been evacuated to Niger, but only something more than 1,000 have subsequently been resettled. And as further resettlements seem increasingly unlikely, evacuees are now hosted in a refugee camp called a transit center outside the capital. So instead of the EU resettling the refugees from Libya, it externalized the resettlement, and Niger was the next link to this chain. Now the field of return presents more manifestations of chain externalization. Here we come to the EU aim of Africa to Africa returns. A main partner in this type of cooperation is, as I mentioned, Nigeria. We see there that Nigeria is facilitating frequent returns of its own citizens from neighboring countries. These returns are organized with the support of the International Organization for Migration, IOM, and the EU. And now we see that this approach is taken one step further in Niger. And the plan is to make Niger a backward transit migration hub. And that would be done by assisting repatriation from Niger to countries of origin. So people residing irregularly in Niger would be deported by the Nigerian authorities to their countries of origin further in Africa. And I said before that Niger has a crucial role as a transit country, and that is in the trans-Saharan route. So from West and Central Africa to North Africa and further on to Europe. And now it is being utilized in the reverse manner. So via the IOM's assisted voluntary return and readmission programs, which are funded by the Emergency Trust Fund for Africa, the EU fund that Julia mentioned at the beginning. As a result, within a few years, Niger has already become the top host country in the world in terms of these programs. So you can see in the slide that we have a dramatic increase in the number of African migrants repatriated through this program from Niger. And here I also have to think of the last proposal for the amendment of the European Border and Coast Guard regulation. So with the 2019 amendment of its regulation, Frontex received a significant boost of its mandate and competences. There is, however, something that did not make it into the final text, and that is a mandate for Frontex to carry out returns from one country to another. And this did not pass from the negotiations, and but with actually it didn't pass this time, but it won't be the first time that such a proposal comes back. And with the rate that the mandate that the mandate of the agency is enhancing, I would not be surprised if I would see it coming back in the future amendment in a couple of years. So it should be kept in mind that the agency also is already preparing the ground for operations in Africa, and it has been working closely with African states in the Africa Frontex intelligence community. It has, I already mentioned, a liaison officer in Niger, and it's preparing its first ever border surveillance operation in the African continent, and that will take place in Senegal. So we'll need to see what this status agreement with Senegal entails in terms of returns cooperation. Now, as a last bit to check this theory, let's try to falsify it. Let's try to falsify the theory that these measures represent a new emerging trend of chain externalization. It could very well be that the interests of the EU simply overlap with those of the Sahel countries, and that is why they're taking some policies over and they're taking these practices further. And could be that these countries are simply drawing inspiration from the more advanced policy model of EU migration control. And we can theorize here by saying that what we are actually facing here is the concept of institutional borrowing, as it has been developed by Daniel Kezenbach. And I would challenge that, however, by saying that institutional boring requires equal relations, and true cooperation is based on equal partnerships. And this is not really what we see in this region. Instead, what we clearly see is that the behavior of the African partners needs to be heavily motivated and reinforced with carrots and sticks, with incentives. And we have different motives used, the triggers, as Dante calls them, for different incentives for different countries. And these also have to do with the negotiating positions of each partner. Turkey is a stronger negotiating partner, so it is promised, for example, visa liberalization. Balkan countries are working together with the EU in view of their integration, so becoming members of the EU. Niger, however, is greatly dependent upon development aid. So it is development assistance that is given with the conditionality of cooperation in mobility control. And I do not have time to elaborate further, but the inequality in the negotiating partners is obvious, and the power dynamics are even sharper between the EU and the Sahel partners. Now, a final argument that I would like to make in this regard is that not only the interests do not happen to coincide, but they can also be fundamentally opposed. So we can acknowledge that there can be some genuine cooperation in terms of security and anti-terrorist measures. Apart from that, however, we notice opposing interests first and foremost if we look at the right to free movement in the region. Niger and the other countries of the Sahel are part of the economic community of ECOWAS. There exists a system of flexibly open borders similar to the Schengen area. The freedom of movement in Africa of nomads and also ethnic groups living on both sides of the borders is being restricted in the name of safeguarding freedom of movement in the Schengen area. There are also financial and development consequences for these countries. The economy of countries such as Niger and Nigeria are heavily rely on intra-ECOWAS migration. And also we have migrant remittances and commercial activities that depend on the passage of migrants. And these are also significantly hampered. And I'm not even going to mention the consequences for human rights and refugee rights, as of course these restrictions oblige migrants, people on the move, to take even more dangerous routes, expose them to violence, expose them to exploitation. They can deny their right to asylum. So to conclude, we reach the conclusion that what is actually happening is the utilization of the Sahel countries essentially to enforce EU border management. And we see this being taken one step further, which allows us to introduce the concept of chain externalization. And as this is the first attempt to develop our understanding of this concept, I welcome comments, particularly on the conceptualization, the development of this concept, how we can take it further, and also if you can identify other regions and other measures where this concept could be useful. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mariana. And last but not least, we have Dr. Adele Rahani from the Ludwig Boltzmann Institute of Fundamental and Human Rights in Austria, presenting on chain externalization within Libya, the legal responsibility of local armed groups.
Hi, everyone. Thank you very much, Emily, for the introduction. And thank you, everyone, for your interest in this issue. So what I'm going to present are just some initial reflections on the pertinence of applying this concept or this perspective of chain externalization to the case of the containment of refugees in Libya. As you all know, as you're all aware, the last years have seen an increased engagement of refugee law scholarship with the situation of refugees trapped within states that cannot offer adequate protection. In this context, attempts of states, particularly in the north, to obstruct refugee movements towards their territories through externalizing migration control efforts, while upholding only a formal commitment to refugee law, have come under intense or detailed scrutiny. And it has also been noted that the Libyan example within this scholarship represents a particularly sophisticated attempt and a particularly worrisome attempt to avoid substantive legal responsibility. It is well known that the EU and its member states, it has also been mentioned before, and particularly Italy, in essence, are enabling Libyan coast guards, amongst others, to prevent access to asylum in Europe, particularly by enhancing their capacity to conduct pullback operations in the central Mediterranean. To date, the scholarly debate, the academic debate on the implications, on the legal implications of such what has been termed cooperative deterrence, has focused on arguments for direct and derived European legal responsibility for the actions of coast guards. Scholars have drawn on different legal instruments and rights, the right to leave, the principle of non-refoulement, extraterritorial jurisdiction, rules of state responsibility, etc. And one must mention increasingly also legal instruments beyond the international refugee law regime, basically to demonstrate that the law is in a good position to accept the challenge posed by externalization efforts, also in the Libyan case. However, once we turn our attention towards refugees who are stranded in Libya, so they're even unable to attempt crossing the sea towards Europe, we see that the task of establishing the ability of the law, of refugee law, to tackle such externalization arrangements effectively becomes significantly harder. In my previous work, I've tried to demonstrate that international refugee law, in fact, fails to fulfill its original purpose of resolving the anomalous legal status of refugees when confronted with a situation like in Libya, where a state or state order is basically disintegrating. Similarly, I would argue that the lens of the concept of chain externalization prompts us to see beyond the externalization efforts from within the EU towards Libya and gain a fuller picture of the reality of the rights of refugees stranded in Libya and stranded in a dysfunctional country. In Libya, as you know, while there is a government, different governments over time that have been recognized by at least relevant parts of the international community formally exists, fundamentally, analysts agree that the country is in a state of political rift, fracture, fragmentation. It lacks a central body that can exercise authority over the entire territory. Wolfram Lacher, for example, has described that, quote, fragmentation has marked Libya's political and military landscape since the demise of Gaddafi's regime. Just in the city of Misrata, there were 236 different revolutionary armed groups by the end of the 2011 civil war. After the war, factions grew even further and countless new armed groups emerged across the country. End quote. Today, we can see that militias, which primarily adhere to tribal loyalties, have captured state institutions, control considerable areas, and we see that rival political entities depend on the goodwill of militias or local armed groups to exert any influence. And it is within this political reality that the efforts of the European Union and its member states to basically obstruct northbound migration or refugee movements from Libya have had significant effect. Ahmad Badi notes, for example, that following the peace agreement in 2015, Libyan authorities were also under pressure to act to curtail migration, owing to the EU's policy priorities, which, as we know, attempted to further strengthen externalization policies. He analyzes that, quote, this momentum trickled down at the communal level, leading armed groups to reconvert themselves into counter-smuggling agents, while integrating state enforcement agencies, such as the border and coastal guards. Political elites were either powerless to halt the rise of informal security providers or actively supported them by way of co-option or sponsorship. Similarly, Mikalev and Reitano have assessed that militia leaders, sensing an imminent end to the political status quo, basically attempted to launder their reputations by accepting incentives to serve as law enforcement partners of international donors. They argue that this co-option creates instability, sabotages the state-building process, and further drives the exploitation and the abuse of refugees in the country. Today we can today we can see that there are militias and local armed groups across the country that obstruct the access of refugees to asylum, and they have different and sometimes rapidly changing levels of attachment or levels of loyalty to the internationally recognized government in Tripoli. And also they have different levels of control over areas in the country. One instructive example is the collaboration between the coast guards and militias operating detention centers. As is very well known, in many cases in Libya, detention centers are only, if at all, nominally under the control of the government and are factually controlled by affiliated militias. Some detention centers are managed by individuals who are officially paid by the government, but in fact work on behalf of militias. The detention center in Zavia, for example, is under the control of the Al-Nasr Brigade, a local militia whose whose commander, Muhammad Kashlaf, also works in cooperation or collusion with the head of the Zavia branch of the Coast Guards, Abdel Rahman al-Milad. Both of them, Kashlaf and Milad, as well as the head of the detention center in Zavia, are listed for sanctions by the Security Council of the UN, including for their involvement in the exploitation of refugees and other migrants. Drawing on the ILC's draft articles on responsibility of states for internationally wrongful acts, we can see that they provide several rules that are at least potentially able to attribute to the Libyan state the interception and consequent or prior detention of refugees under degrading and inhumane conditions in informal centers in Zavia. Evidently, such an assessment, if it claims to be adequate, would need to address the details of individual cases of ill treatment. But we see that generally it is conceivable that, for example, we say that the Al-Nasr brigade that is controlling the detention center, or let's say the actions of coast guards or detention guards can be attributed to the state of Libya when they act in their capacity as either organs of the state according to Libyan law, or they're empowered by the state to exercise elements of the governmental authority, or in some cases, they might carry out conduct in the absence or default of the official authorities in exceptional circumstances. In all of these scenarios, the draft articles on state responsibility would allow for an attribution of their conduct to the Libyan state. Another instructive example is the detention of refugees in other places like Bani Walid, where we see that the internationally recognized administration over certain periods has exercised no or very limited authority or control. In such ungoverned areas in Libya, it proves not only challenging to attribute the conduct of armed non-state actors to the state, but it can also be questioned to what extent Libya even exercises full jurisdiction. This thus undermines the theoretical applicability of key human rights obligations that would allow refugees to access asylum elsewhere. As you know, in principle, human rights law presumes that territorial jurisdiction applies. It is in fact one of the fundamental tenets of the international legal order. However, this presumption of territorial jurisdiction can be challenged. For example, when a state is unable to exercise authority over its entire territory. As has been mentioned, principally underlying externalization arrangement lies the assumption that an application of refugee law that could challenge border control practices can be avoided through keeping refugees away from state jurisdiction and legal responsibility. And I would argue that it is exactly this rationale that applies also to Libyan dynamics of chain externalization within the country, which have indeed led to the creation of at least temporarily ungoverned areas. In other words, the attempt of the EU and its member states to avoid the application of international refugee law through externalizing migration control to Libya triggers the further outsourcing of this function to local armed groups which partly operate in areas outside of the full territorial jurisdiction of Libya. And it is exactly against this backdrop that the question of the rights obligation and of the legal responsibilities of armed non-state actors under international human rights law comes to the fore. As you know, international human rights law generally is based on the goal of protecting individuals against the exercise of arbitrary public power by the state. So consequently, human rights treaties are also almost exclusively open for signature by states. However, although armed non-state actors have not yet been formally endowed with human rights obligations, the fact that such groups increasingly exercise public authority over individuals has also increasingly prompted a debate that challenges the assumption of the non-applicability of human rights norms vis-à-vis such non-state entities. For example, the Security Council, as well as the General Assembly, also human rights monitoring bodies have in some cases recognized that particularly the conduct of armed groups which have established a sort of de facto governmental regime in otherwise ungoverned areas could amount to violations of or abuses of human rights. So to conclude, the Libyan case that I described, the Libyan domestic case, is not a typical example of chain externalization. First of all, the role of armed groups in Libya is not envisaged as part of a conscious state strategy to mirror EU migration policies. Arguably, it's not even intended to circumvent legal responsibilities for outsourcing migration control functions. It rather follows the disintegration of the country's state order. However, I would argue that the prominent role that the EU is playing in shaping the priorities of state authorities as well as of local armed groups in Libya indicates that the perspective of chain externalization can also be applied and may be fruitful for the Libyan context. Secondly, the chain externalization in Libya does not include outsourcing from one state territory to another. So also in this case, it's not a typical case of externalization. However, again, I would argue that the Libyan context amounts to externalization insofar as it involves the challenging of the territorial jurisdiction of the Libyan state in ungoverned areas. So from that perspective, the chain of externalization follows three different jurisdictional spheres: that of EU states, that of areas under control of the Libyan government, and that of ungoverned areas within Libya. So to wrap up, it follows that although there are different crucial differences between the typical cases of externalization and what I'm describing here, the lens of chain externalization can still be helpful, particularly for understanding the full picture of the reality of the rights or the rightlessness of refugees in Libya, and for any attempt to close accountability gaps or gaps in the applicability of relevant refugee law or human rights law. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Adele, and thank you everyone for your really wonderful presentations and for stimulating what I imagine is a lot of thoughts among people. So please do post your questions and comments in the chat. To kick us off, obviously there's a question from Sarah in the chat, but I'll take the moderator's privilege and ask one overarching question while other people warm up. And I know that some of the panelists touched on this, but concretely, what is the difference between the concept or the conceptual framework on chain externalization between other concepts such as norm diffusion, labels such as the domino effect, or simply how is it different from the transposition of policies between global north to global north? And so maybe if we go in order and in the order of the presentation. So Maria Giulia, did you want to start?
Yeah, okay, Emily. Yeah, as you say, like my presentation was not strictly focused on chain externalization, but I think that also in the Tunisian context, there are many instances in which then Tunisia is reproducing with third countries what are the policies that it is following with respect to the European Union and the European states, in particular with regard to the readmission policies, the pushbacks, and in general, what I think is very dangerous of all these policies of support of the European Union with third countries in the management of borders and migration control is also the negative influence that these policies can have on free circulation, free movement of people, also, for example, within the African context. And this is very much linked to what Mariana was saying about ECOWAS, for example, the countries on the African countries and the West region. This is stimulating a policy of suspicions and fear. In particular, there are countries that have been are becoming very suspicious also with regard to persons that are embarking in travels and journeys heading for Europe, and this is implying also more checks and more controls on passenger vehicles transporting citizens, and this is inevitably affecting the free circulation and free movement, also boosting harassment and stigmatization of migrants within the same community. This policy of suspicions has also led, for example, to thinking that free borders and or regimes of free movement, for example, within ECOWAS, is responsible for infiltration of armed groups, terrorists, smugglers groups, and so African states, because of the European example, the European pressure, are adopting tighter border controls across their regions, and not only they're adopting, so they are controlling the borders even more, but they are also adopting enacting legislations that are somehow really offending the process of integration and free circulation within the African continent. And one of the examples that Mariana was mentioning is Niger. I think this is the most emblematic case, but the pressures by the European Union have also led, for example, to adopting a legislation which criminalizes in Niger aiding, abetting, or procuring any movements and passage of migrants, because we know that Niger is then the transit area to go then to Libya, and then from Libya to Europe, and with the introduction also penalty of up to 10 years of imprisonment for facilitating this phenomenon, these passages of people. So I think the European policy and pressure is also leading to a further criminalization of migration within third countries, which is extremely dangerous.
Thank you. Gamza or Mariana or Adele, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, hello, sure. Well, just a brief point about your distinctions about how this is different, how chain externalization differs from norm diffusion or position of transfer of different policies, I think these could be the ways, like norm diffusion could be a way how chain externalization occurs, but the distinct side of what we call chain externalization is the transfer of externalization policies from one context to another. So I think this is one key aspect, is that this refers strictly to the transfer of externalization policies, and because of the dynamic also it creates in the migration control, we deemed appropriate to call it chain externalization. Don't want to take so much of time, so I'll stop here.
Thanks. Does anyone else want to jump in of our speakers?
If I may, I could add, or rather repeat one more point. What Gamze said is one of the two most important elements indeed. So we are talking about, so we could be talking about norm diffusion or any other type of policy change due to EU pressure in these countries. And the classic example that Julia just mentioned, the Niger becoming the first country in the region to criminalize smuggling, and they went also even further than that, legislating the detention of people that have been smuggled, so of irregular migrants. So we could apply these theories there, but here, as Gamze indeed said, we're talking about what we understand as policies and measures of externalization. And the other thing that could differentiate this concept, let's say, from norm diffusion, or what I said in my presentation, the concept of institutional borrowing, is precisely this unequal relationship between the partners. And it goes so far that in other works, I talk about a neo-colonial approach in this type of relationship. We're not talking about equal partners that are sitting at the table and putting out their interest in making agreements. We're talking about dependent partners, especially when we're talking about the countries in the Sahel, that even go against their national interests in order to serve those of the EU. What I still find so difficult to comprehend is that the carrot, let's say, or if we see it on the opposite, the stick from the EU in these countries is EU development aid. But by stopping their migration, so their people from going further, they're losing in remittances. And from the statistics that we see from the IOM, we see that the benefit to the local economy from remittances is much bigger than the benefit that they have from development aid. So it is still, I struggle to comprehend what is the benefit at the end for these countries. I don't know if Adele would like to add anything with respect to the local partners, the private persons involved.
Yeah, I think for the Libyan case, what I understand is that the incentive is basically positioning oneself in the eyes of the international community as actors which contributes to the goal of preventing or obstructing access to asylum in Europe. So there is like an overlap in the not an overlap. There is like the interests of the European Union and its power within the regional political context trigger these local armed groups as well as authorities to adapt their own policy goals and their own positioning within the country. Also, given that they perceive that Libya is in a kind of what Mikalev has called the political endgame, or at least in a form of political transformation, where local armed groups have an interest in in strengthening their reputation within the country and towards international partners.
Adele, do you want to take the question in the chat from Sarah? I can read it out. So Sarah has asked, for non-state armed groups, could a parallel be drawn with the applicability of international humanitarian law? For example, where requirements of non-state groups to have an organised command control over part of territory are met.
Thank you for that. I'm not sure if I, please correct me if I misunderstood the question, but definitely the question of the applicability of international humanitarian law is very relevant, as that would open up the possibility for new obligations of non-state actors. But the question for Libya exactly is if we have a situation of non-international armed conflict or internal armed conflict, and probably at the moment we don't have it, which would require that there is a situation of that involves protracted armed confrontations between different forces, government forces, local armed groups within the territory of Libya. And currently we see tensions, we see confrontations here and there, but I don't think we're in a situation of non-international armed conflict. If we would have that situation, then obviously like obligations such as also the treatment of displaced populations within the country, the obligation to treat any civilians under their control humanely and without any adverse distinctions that we have in international humanitarian law would apply, that currently don't apply or not formally apply to non-state actors within Libya. I'm not sure whether I answered the question or not.
Thanks very much, Adele, and I'm sure Sarah can comment in the chat if she would like further clarification. Mariana, did you want to ask your question to your fellow panelists? Well, I guess you've asked it to participants, haven't you?
Exactly. This is rather a question for participants. So if anyone would like to either put something in the chat or participate in the discussion in a different way that could help us take it further, we'd be grateful.
Just to maybe contribute in that sense, I don't think that we are reviewing this in terms of EU policies, but this doesn't necessarily have to be that way as well. I mean, we have been looking at how EU's externalization policies have been affecting third countries, but this could go for any other maybe North country, I would say, and the chain created from there as well. So, you know, Emily was mentioning could it be applied to Australia or any other context? So I don't think that this needs to be limited to EU either.
Yeah, and similarly in the US and Central American context, there's, from research I've done, there seems to be a direct correlation between the US pushing and pressuring Mexico to apprehend asylum seekers on its border, and then the flow-on effect from the numbers apprehended then by Mexican authorities greatly increasing as a result of the carrot and stick that you've spoken about. And I do have a number of other questions, so I know we've only got a few minutes left, so I can pose a couple of different ones, and people can potentially pick and choose what they want to reflect on, and we could just do one last round with everyone. I think my first question is, how do you conceive of the role of other non-state actors within this conceptual framework? So obviously, Adele, you've been talking about militias, and I noted that you said, that role isn't typical, but I wonder, given the heavy involvement of private actors and international organizations within, traditional externalization, why we don't view that as typical. For example, carriers being involved airline stuff being involved and IOM, for example. So that's one question. And my second question is, obviously Adele also touched on this, but how do you conceive of chain externalization affecting lines of responsibility and responsibility sharing? Does it push us more towards a shared model of international responsibility? Maria Giulia, did you want to go first? And if people could limit it just to a couple of minutes each, because I know we have to close soon.
Okay. So yeah, maybe with regard to the role of international organizations, and we know very well that the role and the presence of some organizations, such as in particular UNHCR and IOM, is very strong, especially in some contexts. What we should look at probably is much more their mandate. So of course the presence of IOM in certain contexts in the and in the management of borders is definitely stronger than and the management of migration is definitely stronger than a UNHCR. But I see sometimes a risk in the strong presence of these organizations. Because many of the activities that are funded by the European Union and in third countries, which concern the control of the borders and the strengthening of the frontiers, are also carried out with support of some organizations, some in particular like big migration refugee related organizations such as IOM and UNHCR, which works very closely with the European Union, in particular in the management, for example, of voluntary returns, and or they produce essential information for the European Union on migrants and refugees, and so sometimes the European Union members and the European Union and members and like northern countries use this organization to support the sustainability of their policies of management of borders and migration control, so like presenting them as a more like exploiting the humanitarian mandate of some of these organizations, and that because of their role contribute to the sustainability of European policies. So I think that to a certain extent, this can contribute, even if indirectly, to the to externalization policies, and can be also quite worrisome as a process.
I think we are probably, unfortunately, out of time. I know that I posed two big questions. But perhaps, you know, I'm sure we can continue the conversation on, and I'm sure our panelists would be very happy to hear from participants who didn't ask questions in this time, if they wanted to get in touch and share any further thoughts that they had, or other case studies or settings and regions that they think of post this discussion. But from me, thank you so much, all of you, for this really, really interesting and I think timely presentation, given the, you know, the chain externalization that is occurring and the ongoing externalization between developed countries as well. So a huge thank you from me, and yeah, I'll say goodbye to everyone now, and thank you for joining us on a Friday.